friends, family, and others. My name's Rory Collins. I'm the head of the Nuffield Department of Population Health. And I think you can tell from the fact that there are so many people here that as a department we're incredibly proud of people who make it to professor as well as associate professor and all the other grades in between. And we really want to celebrate the fact that that Jonathan today is going to give his inaugural lecture as professor. And for us, these are very special days. Very good to have family here, and I'm sure other friends of Jonathan. And I think it's really interesting for everybody, actually, to see that from this end, it looks like it's a kind of seamless track towards professorial position. But in reality, of course, it's a bit of a random walk. And some ups, some downs, often no strategic plan other than to do good research. And that's what we've also come here to celebrate. So Jonathan's going to talk about maths, Mexico, and meta-analysis. And personally, I'd like to kind of thank him and the team who put in so much effort into making the Mexico study such a success. Been a huge amount of time, huge amount of work, very hard to get people to understand how valuable a study it was until relatively recently, and to have really kept on in there for so long, and now seeing the fruits of it is very exciting. So Jonathan, thank you very much for agreeing to give this talk. It's probably one of the hardest talks anybody ever has to give, and so we'll hear Jonathan's random walk on maths, Mexico and meta-analyses. Thanks, Jonathan.
Okay, thanks, Rory. It's very strange to be looking at this collection of individuals in front of me. People from, my family, some friends, colleagues, some people that fit into more than one of those categories. So firstly, thanks all for coming, especially those of you that are obviously extending your working day by an hour. Some of you have cut short your working day. Now, this lecture should have been given 3 years ago. I was made a professor in August 2019, and this lecture was lined up for May 2020, but for obvious reasons it was cancelled. They say better late than never. I'm going to let you be the judge of that in about an hour's time. So the first thing you have to do when you're thinking about a lecture like this is the title, of course. So I've come up with Maths, Mexico and Meta-Analyses. So I think when you think about a title, you want it to be relevant to the subject that you're going to talk about. Perhaps roll off the tongue, and I kind of felt that this did, and hopefully intriguing in terms of making you want to come to lecture and find out what I'm going to talk about. But to be honest, I thought about changing this title just a couple of weeks ago, because for those in the audience that heard Richard Haynes's inaugural lecture 2 weeks ago, which incidentally was brilliant, if you weren't here, watch it on YouTube, it was excellent. Richard's lecture was called Not Entirely by Chance. And it was only really over the last week or so, when I was thinking about what I wanted to say, that I really realised that chance and random events have had a really big impact on both my life and my career. And so if I'm allowed to change the title slightly, I'm going to change the title to Maths, Mexico and Meta-Analyses Entirely by Chance. Okay, so the first chance event is that I was lucky enough to be born in God's country. That's right. For those of you that don't know me well and can't tell from my increasingly diminishing accent, I'm Welsh. I was born in Cardiff in 1977 and lived my whole childhood in a village just on the outskirts of the city. Now, the second chance event that had a big impact in my life is that I was born in August, so I was one of the youngest in my school year, but I was actually born 7 weeks early, so I should have been born in late September. So even if I was born around about on time, or even 2 or possibly 3 weeks early, I would have been in a different school year, would never have met Ellen, and kids, you would never have had to come to this lecture. Okay, so I went to my local primary school in 1981, and primary school at that time was pretty straightforward, to be honest. It's nothing like what it is for you right now, Thomas, what it was for you, Laura, a few years ago, Nisha. In fact, the only goal that I remember being set for me by my teachers was to learn the alphabet, to be able to write the alphabet, and to know my times tables up to 12. As you can see, I played in the school football team. I played on the right side of midfield. I was quite fast. I enjoyed running at defenders with the ball at my feet. I didn't have that much interest in parsing unless I really had to. And what the defenders were doing, I really had very little interest in. And as at least a couple of you in the room know, that my attitude to football hasn't really changed much in the last 30 years. Now, if you'd asked me at the time what I wanted to be when I grew up, I would probably have said a bin man. And the reason I wanted to be a bin man is because, as far as I could tell, they only had to work one morning a week. This is true, actually. Now, although there was nothing wrong with my data per se, my inference was, of course, wholly wrong. And it would only be much later in my life when I fully appreciated that my data collection strategy was flawed, and there was actually no analysis of it that I could have done to reach the correct conclusion, that I would have realized that maybe a different career is what I wanted. Here comes Richard. Okay, so I went to my local secondary school in 1988, and I enjoyed all the lessons, to be honest, but I particularly enjoyed maths and the sciences because I was quite handy at them. Now, maths at secondary school, Laura and Aisha, you're starting to realize, or maybe it's different now, but when I was at secondary school, it was all about circles, triangles, sometimes circles within triangles, or vice versa, rearranging and solving equations. And I had good teachers, and it all made sense to me. So when it came to choosing A-levels, it was obvious that I should do maths A-level. That was a no-brainer for me. But the question is, what else should I do? And at this point, I need to introduce you to the fact that I have two older brothers. My brother Giles in the front row here. He was pretty good at maths and economics and computing, did those at A-level. And I have another brother, a few years older than Giles, David, who's not here. He also did maths, economics, and history. Now, I knew that I wasn't going to do a language or a humanity at A-level. I thought about doing art. Jai, you'll probably recall, some of my GCSE coursework in art was really very good. I should probably, with hindsight, have done physics and or chemistry, because I probably would have been quite good at them. But my eldest brother, in his wisdom, said, you shouldn't do them, they're really hard, and maybe they're not for you. So I didn't. I ended up being persuaded by my brothers to do very similar, in fact, the same A-levels as you, Jai. I did maths, I did economics, and I did computing. And I enjoyed those. I enjoyed all those subjects. Now, most people, of course, do 3 A-levels, but because I was good at maths, my maths teacher, I had great teachers, they asked me if I was interested in doing further maths A-level as well. And I thought, well, why not? I mean, there's no downside, really, is there? Either it's too hard and I drop it, in which case I've just helped cement my kind of conventional maths knowledge, or actually I can do it and I get 2 A-levels for the price of 1. My eldest brother, Dave, again, good advice from him was, are you really sure about this? Because there's only a couple of people in my year who did further maths, and they were really clever, and I'm not sure you should do it. But I ignored him, and I think it was probably the right decision for me. Okay, so I've gone a bit far. So I got to the end of A-levels, and I did well on my mock A-levels, and I did really well in maths and further maths. And it was at that time I had a conversation with my 6th form tutor, Dr. Dart, and he said, well, you've never heard of me before, and you got the results. And he pulled me aside and he said, have you thought about, well, he asked me about university, and I told him the universities I was thinking of applying to, and he said, okay. And he said, have you thought about applying to Oxford? And I said, well, no, I haven't. It hadn't even crossed my mind. And he said, well, you could, because in some ways there's no downside, because you could just apply, and there's an exam you can do. At that time, there was an exam you could do for maths. If you passed the exam, you got invited for interview. If you passed the interview, you got an unconditional offer for university, a 2E offer. So there was really no downside. And so I did apply, and I was fortunate enough to get in. And so in October 1995, I found myself here, which is, for those of you who don't know the colleges that well, this is Wadham College. It's on, what street is it on? Parks Road, just on Parks Road, next door to the King's Arms pub, for those of you who know the centre. This is where I lived. This was my room in the first year. This is staircase 1. Each staircase had 8 rooms. Each room had 2 students. It was like an apartment. But it was, very old-fashioned. It's an original building, of course. For those 16 students, there was 1 bath and 1 shower. Sorry, 1 bath and 2 toilets. And if I wanted a shower, you had to come down the stairs, walk along here, walk to the adjacent side of the quad, and go into staircase 2 for the shower. Now, the mid-late 1990s was a great time to be a student, I think. Music was great. Whether you thought you liked Oasis or not before October 1995, you pretty much had no choice but to like them afterwards. A pint of beer in the local college bar cost £1. Even politics was getting exciting with the promise of what Tony Blair's New Labour might bring. But of course, as well as having fun, I did also have a degree to do. And as I said, I found maths at school fine. You were taught something, you understood it, you knew how to apply it, and you remembered it, and the exams were fairly easy, really. Maths at university is a totally different ballgame. It's literally like a new language. In fact, it was probably about 5 minutes into my first lecture in my first year, my first term of my first year, that I realised I had absolutely no idea what the lecturer was talking about, and I was really going to have to work if I had any chance of getting any kind of degree at the end of these 3 years, let alone a half-decent one. So, for example, algebra never involves solving an equation for x at university. And while geometry does still involve circles, they're really not the sort of circles you thought you knew. So this is a sort of example from algebra and geometry that I found on the web. So I'll take you through it. So as best I can. So we've got alpha, gamma, real numbers, alpha's non-zero, beta's a complex number, beta bar is at least as big as alpha gamma. There's an equation that equals 0, defines a circle in a complex plane, of course. Find the center and radius. What does the equation describe if this is this? Sketch some circles for some different parameters. Now, I can't do that now, but to be honest, at the time that was probably okay, because they start easy, these questions, and then they get into the meat of it. So a little bit later, show that the complex function f of z equals beta z bar divided by z bar satisfies, for all beta non-zero, satisfies f of the complex c alpha beta gamma equals c alpha beta gamma. But the good news is they've given you a hint. And here's the hint. Hint. F of c equals c means that f of z belongs to c for all z belonging to c, and for all omega, or for all w belonging to c, there exists a z belonging to c such that f of z equals w. So, I mean, thanks very much. So I don't know where I would have been without that hint. But fortunately, there's a lot of mathematics at university you can also do that's much more applied. And I was extremely lucky to have a lecturer of applied statistics called Daniel Lunn, who very sadly died a few years ago, and it would have been wonderful if he could have been here today. So Dan was my lecturer of applied probability and statistics, and it must have been about March 1997 when Dan was teaching us about what odds ratios were, and he illustrated the concept with the following example. And when I saw this, it made me think, do you know what? Maybe there's a career for me in mathematics after all. So this was the example. In the mid-1990s, there was a lot of controversy about bias in cricket. In particular, in test matches in Australia, the Indian team were saying the Australian umpires were biased against their own batsmen. And so these scientists were paid to analyse leg before wicket rates of teams visiting Australia over a period of time. And so every good paper has got a method section. This is the best method section I've ever read. Cricket's played by 2 teams of 11 players. The objective is to score more runs than your opponents. It's a bit more complex than that, but and then it starts talking about it. One way in which you can get out is this thing called LBW, leg before wicket. Here's the key thing. The umpire may give an LBW decision if he thinks that the ball was in line with the wickets, would have hit them had it not the batsman's leg first. And then I love this. There are more technicalities to this rule, but it's not necessary to outline them here. The point is, this is a subjective decision, and at the time, in the late 1990s, we didn't have Hawkeye. There was no way of knowing whether it would have hit the wicket. And, you know, future-proof your papers, people. This debate cannot be settled using television replays. Well, of course, now it can. So it cannot yet be settled using television replays. So they analysed the data. And in a summary, what we've got here is we've got the top 6 batsmen of various teams versus Australia. So what this is saying, so let's look at India first, because this is where the hypothesis arose from. So Indian batsmen were no more likely to be given out LBW than their Australian counterparts. So the odds ratio, compared with Australian batsmen, Indian batsmen were only 6% more likely to be given out LBW, and this high probability means that that's the sort of difference that can happen by the play of chance. So no evidence of bias against Indian batsmen. But look at this, poor old England. English batters, 70% higher odds of being given out leg before wicket than their Australian counterparts. Probability of seeing something like that by the play of chance, 4 in 1,000. So there's something going on here. That doesn't mean it's bias. There might be very good reasons why the Australian fast bowlers at that point were particularly good at getting English batters out LBW. The English batters could have been useless, but of course the Australian bowlers, are used to bowling on Australian wickets. There's lots of factors. And so, of course, the end of every good paper says we need to do more research. The approach taken, blah, 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 has highlighted some differences between LBW rates. It still remains, however, to take account of the factors outlined above, further data to be collected, analysis to be done. And I just thought, this is brilliant. I thought these people have been paid to analyse cricket matches, and at the end of their conclusion is they need more money to analyse more cricket matches. How could I get into this sort of thing? So, at the end of my maths degree, in fact, this was the end of my maths degree. At the end of my maths degree, I decided I wanted to stay in Oxford and do a master's degree in applied statistics. I was interviewed by Peter Donnelly, many of you will know, and I can't have impressed him that much, because while I did get offered a place, I didn't get offered any funding for for university or college fees or a stipend. But actually, as it turned out, this was extremely fortunate for me, because it meant that although my parents were able and kind enough to be able to loan me the money for the fees, and my brother, Jai, Mum, I don't think you ever knew this, but Jai lent me about £2,000 for beer money. That still wasn't really quite enough to live on. And so I had to find some other ways of making money. I got a part-time job as a barman in the Dewdrop Inn for a couple of months. I then decided to work as a barman in the Turf Tavern for a few months. But I thought, actually, I do actually need to work, so I stopped doing that. And I was very lucky because at the time, as a master's student, you could earn extra money by marking undergraduate statistics scripts. And so I offered to do this. And coincidentally, the tutor that I was marking for was Dan Lunn from Worcester College. And as I met Dan more and I got to know him a little bit, and I told him about the LBW example that made me want to do the masters anyway. And he said, okay, so John, what are you going to do next year? And I said, well, I really enjoyed medical statistics at the time, so I thought, well, I'm applying for jobs in pharmaceutical companies, so I've applied for a job in Pfizer and places like that. And he said, no, you don't want to do that. Trust me, you don't want to do that. He said, how do you fancy going to Australia for a year? Because I've got these friends, John Symes and Tony Keach. They run a clinical trial centre in the University of Sydney. I'm sure they'd be interested in you. I'm sure they'd take you for a year. But the other thing that happened around the same time is I met Ellen. This was about the second term of our fourth year. So Ellen was at Hertford College, which is next door to Wadham. And yes, we met halfway through the fourth year. And kids, I know what you're thinking. First is, you're right, your mum hasn't changed a day in 25 years. And the other thing, yes, this is an inflatable sheep over my right-hand shoulder. So this, of course, left me with quite a difficult decision to make. What do I do next year? Do I stay in the UK and try and find a job where it's much easier to develop this new relationship? Or do I move to the other side of the year, to the other side of the world for a year? So here I am. Now, October 1999, my first day in Australia, and what a year it was. There was the Millennium celebrations within a couple of months. There were the Olympics in 2000, and I saw various things. I had the privilege of watching this man play rugby in what was widely thought of as being one of the best rugby matches in the world, Australia, New Zealand, in front of 100,000 people at Bledisloe Cup. I even got to meet Harold Bishop from Neighbours. But I think it was a good year for you as well, Alan, because you were working in Liverpool, but it gave you a great opportunity to come to Australia for a couple of weeks of holiday, which you almost certainly wouldn't have done had I not been there. Unfortunately, when Alan arrived, it rained almost constantly in Sydney for 2 weeks. And actually, it does rain a lot in Sydney, and you're quite unlucky. But it's kind of set up a running joke in our household. Wherever and whenever we go in the world on holiday, it always seems to rain, doesn't it? But as you can see, we always seem to have fun, don't we, kids? Sorry, Thomas. Okay, now, so my year in Australia wasn't just a holiday, of course. I worked in the Clinical Trials Centre in Sydney, and I cut my teeth on a trial called Lipid, which many of you will know very well. It was a cholesterol-lowering trial with pravastatin in patients with ischemic heart disease. And this is where I learned about medical statistics in practice, not just in a classroom setting. And this gave me my first taste of the scientific process, how to structure a paper, how to write a paper, how to respond to reviewers' comments, how to design analyses, and so on. And unbelievably, both of these things actually got into the Lancet. They're not brilliant papers. One's a subsidiary analysis, one's a testing the hypothesis of whether pravastatin might reduce the risk of fracture. But it was a fantastic experience for me just to get to start my academic career. But after a year in Australia, I did want to return back to the UK, and I found myself working as an epidemiologist at University College London. And I worked on a prospective cohort study called the British Regional Heart Study, which consists of about 7,735 men. So a prospective study is where you recruit a group of individuals. I'm not sure I'm looking at you lot. Most of you lot should know. A prospective study is where you recruit a group of individuals and you ask them questions, you measure things about them, and you follow up and find out what happens, but you don't intervene. It's not an experiment. That's why it's called an observational study, as opposed to randomized trials where you're performing an experiment and you'll give group A a pill and you'll give group B maybe a placebo, and you find out what happens. Now, after a few months, my managers asked me would I be interested in combining my work with a PhD. And so again, without ever really planning to do one, I did. And this is the rather catchy title, Within Person Variation and Coronary Risk Factors, Implications for the Etiology and Prevention of Coronary Disease. It was about studying the individual and joint relevance of cholesterol, blood pressure, and smoking to coronary heart disease risk in the context of a situation where you can underestimate their impact because of something called regression dilution bias, which itself arises because of a phenomenon called regression to the mean, which basically says that if you start at the top, the only way is down. If you start at the bottom, the only way is up. And it was towards the end of my PhD in 2003 when I was giving a talk on this in London, where Gary Whitlock and Robert Clark were in the audience. And most of you will know Robert. He's sat in the far back, smiling there. But many of you won't have known Gary. So Gary was an epidemiologist from New Zealand who joined CTSU in 2001, where he worked on large-scale studies with Sarah Lewington and with Richard and Rory and with Robert, until his death, sadly, about 10 years ago at the age of 49. Now, I was lucky to have known and worked with Gary for nearly 10 years. He taught me a lot about epidemiology, in particular how to rigorously examine a topic, plan a set of investigations, question my assumptions, and then interpret my results in the broader context of what other studies had found. We also shared a common love of rugby. I mean, he was a New Zealander, so it was a lot easier for him to enjoy rugby than me as a Welshman. But he was very kind to me on the many Monday mornings when Wales had managed to snatch defeat yet again from the jaws of victory. And I found this email from him to me on the 5th of June 2010, where Wales had lost 31-34. Oh, Dave, you made it. This is good timing. So, dear John, commiserations on the rugby. However, Wales scored 48% of the points. So, in an attempt to diminish the tyranny of dichotomous thinking, they should be considered to have also experienced 48% of a victory, which is, or should be, nearly as good as 52% of a victory. And that was Gary, and I have lots of very fond memories of him, and I'm extremely grateful for everything he taught me. Now, what Gary and others helped me realize was the need for scale when doing epidemiology. And this is best illustrated by this slide, which I've pinched from Sarah Lewington, which I think Paul Sherlock had developed, and lots of you have presented in the past. So what it shows is what happens if you take a random subset of 5,000 people, 50,000 people, or 500,000 people, and you try and understand the relevance of blood pressure to the risk of a heart attack, overall and at different ages. So if you take a typical 5,000 person study, so this is the sort of scale of the study I was working on in London, and you try to plot what the association is between blood pressure on this axis and the risk of heart disease on this axis. This is a doubling scale, but it's not that important. At best, all you can see is that older people are higher risk than younger people, but you have no idea what the associations are between any of these points. All of these vertical lines are uncertainty estimates around point estimates you can barely see with the naked eye. So you can't tell anything when you're only looking at 5,000 people. If you just go up a factor of 10, go to 50,000 people, the picture starts to become a lot clearer. You can start to see now that at different ages there are strong associations, such that people with higher blood pressure have higher risks of heart disease, but there's still lots of uncertainty. There's a lot of scatter around these lines. So in particular, in younger people, I'm still just about in this bracket. In younger people, is the association perhaps J-shaped? Is it perhaps flat down here? In older people, is it possible that actually there's no association? So there's lots of uncertainty. And it's only really when you dial up again to another factor of 10, where you can really see what's going on. So now you can barely see the vertical line with these uncertainty estimates, and what you see is the point estimates, and you can see very strong, what we call log linear associations between blood pressure and the risk of coronary heart disease. So a few weeks after their trip to London, my UCL supervisors thought there might be an opportunity for us to work with Sarah and Gary and Robert on some future epidemiological projects. And so we arranged a trip to Oxford to discuss this, where I met these two for the first time. And trust me, this meeting was anything but restful or relaxing. In fact, these were pretty much the faces they gave me. They looked at me after I'd finished telling them what I thought about cholesterol and the risk of heart disease. Of course, I'm kidding. Richard and Rory were extremely hospitable and interested in what I had to say. And I must have done something right, because about a month after that meeting, I got an email from Robert saying, oh, there's a job becoming available. Would I be interested in applying to be a senior statistician at CTSU? And I was, and I applied, and then I came to CTSU in 2004 to work on various projects, where I've been ever since. Almost institutionalized, you could say. Now, when I arrived, Sarah Parish, who I can't quite see, Sarah Parish was given the enviable task of managing me. And Sarah, I would actually like to thank you publicly for supporting me in my career for the last 20 years, and in particular by allowing me the freedom to get involved in as many different projects as I wanted to. And the good thing about CTSU has always been that there are so many interesting things to get involved in. And I've been very lucky to have worked in many of them. There's kind of evidence I tried to reflect by this word cloud that I generated from the titles of some of my papers over the first 15 years. Now, while I worked for Sarah Parish, I mostly worked with Sarah Lewington, Robert Clark, and Gary in this first few years. But on various prospective cohort studies, including the Whitehall study and the prospective studies collaboration. But early on, Sarah also introduced me to Colin and Martin, who at the time had recently started a randomized trial called SHARP. And what they really needed is they needed a statistician to do a lot of the day-to-day work on that trial. So for those of you that don't know SHARP, or maybe can't remember, SHARP was a randomized trial of ezetimibe, a combination of two cholesterol-lowering drugs, ezetimibe plus simvastatin, in about 9,500 patients with chronic kidney disease. And this was the main result. So this line, this is the incidence of something bad. So this is the probability of happening what's called a major atherosclerotic event. You don't need to know the definition, but it's something bad. And you can see that those patients given placebo, more of them had the event than those patients given ezetimibe simvastatin. And the risk ratio is 0.83, so a 17% proportional reduction in the the risk of having a major atherosclerotic event if you were randomized to the cholesterol-lowering drug rather than the placebo. And it was at this time as well I first got to work with Kirsty Reith and Will Harrington and Carl on the SHARP trial. Kirsty and Will are clinicians, and they were involved in a lot of the coding for the trial. Carl's a trial programmer, and I've had the privilege of working with Carl for many years in lots of different trials. So when this came out, it was clear that this was going to be kind of big news for the treatment, how patients with kidney disease were to be treated, or at least it should be big news. And so Colin, in all his wisdom, decided that Kirsty, Will, and I should go on a media training course, just in case we found ourselves in the situation of being interviewed by a journalist. Now, I'm not, you see smiling already. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of what happened on that course, except to say that Colin in particular found it very entertaining. And if you want to know more, I'm sure he'll tell you afterwards. But suffice to say, I should probably have taken it a bit more seriously. But the thing is, I knew something that Colin didn't, which is that I already had experience of talking to the press about statins. Because about 7 years earlier, when I worked in London, I was contacted by this journalist, Peter Silverton. He's writing an article, Statins are the wonder drug for those at risk of heart disease. Should everyone be on them? Asked Peter Silverton. I don't know how he got my number, but he contacted me when I was in London, and we had we spoke for an hour about my research, about how I was studying cholesterol and the risk of heart disease. He also asked me about statins and quite a lot, and I was telling him what I knew about statins. I worked on the lipid trial. I had 2 papers in the Lancet. I pretty much knew a lot. And then he told me his article was coming out on the 6th of July, but he didn't have time to share it with me beforehand. Oh, that's fine, okay. So 6th of July, I was really keen to see what was written, which parts of that hour-long conversation he really decided to summarize. So we started with a bit of an intro. Okay, he went to the Royal Free Lab, which is where I was working. He had his cholesterol measured. The machine that Mike Hill can tell you about did something very fancy. The analyzer added some enzymes, did some clever calculations, estimated the good cholesterol, estimated the bad cholesterol. A few days later, he got some results. Bad news, his good cholesterol was good, but his bad cholesterol was bad. Very high, in fact, over 9. The UK average is 6. Doctor said, well, why don't I give you 20 milligrams of simvastatin? Slow dose, but at least it's something. Okay. And then the quotes come. I thought, brilliant. Statins, the new aspirin, said Professor Rory Collins. Okay. Fine. Only they're safer. The new aspirin, only they're safer than aspirin, which would be prescription only if launched today. That's a nice quote, Rory. That's good. They block the enzyme involved in the synthesis of cholesterol in the liver, explained Rory. And they increase the receptors on the surface of the liver cells, which drag the LDL out of your blood and excrete it. That's why statins work. I thought, this journalist is good. Wonder what he's going to say for me. Rory Collins went on. Suggests that doctors shouldn't even bother wasting money on cholesterol tests. They should just prescribe statins to people at high risk of heart attack or stroke. I mean, I told him that, but anyway, he chose to quote Rory. Okay, getting towards the end of the article now, like I'm scrolling down, I think there's not much of this article left. He hasn't mentioned me yet. He said, can we now unequivocally state that statins reduce coronary heart disease? That was it. That was it. This is true. You can Google this. This is real. Yes, said Jonathan Emberson, who's analysing the British Regional Heart Study data at the Royal Free. So I must admit, I was hoping for a little bit more, but at least I didn't say no. But it seems that not everyone in the world is willing to take my view on it, or even Rory's, because statins haven't always had the good press that they deserve. And it's not necessarily always to blame the newspapers. They generally do just try to report what scientists are claiming. But unfortunately, although there's been an awful lot of good science done on statins in the past, and a huge amount done from people in this building, there's also been some less than good studies done. Often due to study design, so non-randomized studies, a bit like when I was collecting data on how hard it was to be a bin man. But even good study designs can get unlucky in their results. And here's an example of a good study, a randomized controlled trial, placebo-controlled, but with an unlucky result. So in 2008, when SHARP was still going on, there was another trial called SEAS, the study of simvastatin and ezetimibe patients with aortic stenosis, about 1,800 patients. And one of the outcomes it looked at when it finished was cancer. And this was a tertiary outcome, one of lots of different outcomes that had been assessed. And as you can see, among those allocated the drug, 101 developed cancer versus 65 allocated placebo. So this looks bad. This suggests, if it's real, a 50% increase in the risk of cancer if you're given this combination cholesterol-lowering pill. So the question is this real or just bad luck in a single trial? And it's important to know because ezetimibe at the time was a very new drug. If this was believed and taken up by the FDA, this would have killed the drug and would have killed SHARP. Luckily, we were in the position in SHARP, as well as another trial, to test this hypothesis with what we call interim data from the SHARP trial, for us to look at the unblinded cancer results in SHARP, plus another trial to test this hypothesis. And this is what we did. Two trials, so the SHARP trial plus the Improve It trial, together included over 20,000 patients and 40,000 person years of follow-up. It's about 5 times the size of the information as came from the SEAS trial. And as you can see here, this is called a forest plot. So numbers to the left indicate that the drug is better, numbers to the right indicate that the drug is worse, and this line down the middle indicates that the drug does nothing at all. There's a solid line. So as you can see, there was no evidence from SHARP and Improve It that this combination pill influenced the risk of cancer. And we were able to, on the back of this, to be able to continue the trial successfully. And at the end of SHARP and at the end of Improve It, there was no evidence that ezetimibe could cause cancer. Now, we had to do this really quickly because we wanted to get the results together for a Monday morning press conference, I think. So we did that. Richard convinced me to work on the weekend, which I don't normally like to do and I very rarely do. But we worked all day on the Saturday. We even dragged Martin in to be looking through notes of what was going on in various cancers. And Richard said, well, I remember saying, well, we've got 2 days, it's fine. But he didn't know that Martin and I had another engagement on the Sunday. Because what we were doing on the Sunday was we'd been entered into the Bampton six-a-side cricket competition. So along with, so there's Martin there, there's me, and we ended up winning it, which was amazing. Largely due to, I think, Derek's bowling. Graham's batin, there's Derek, there's Graham. Martin's captaincy, I would say, overall. But I chipped in too. Martin reminded me the day I actually took a wicket, my first ball, that I bowled. And then the first ball that I faced, I managed to score a 4. Yeah, it was a nice weekend. Very odd. Saturday was busy with work, Sunday was busy with cricket. Anyway, back to randomised trials and the need to consider all of the evidence rather than just thinking about single studies. And this is where we get into the world of meta-analyses. So a meta-analysis is a mathematical combination of the results from all of the trials that have looked at a particular question, rather than just cherry-picking your favourite or the one that tends to test your hypothesis. And I've been fortunate enough to work on something called the Cholesterol Treatment Trialist Collaboration for about the last 15 years or so. This is led, the group's led by Colin, and there's lots of mugshots here of people who currently work in the group and have worked in the group at various times over the years. And what the CTT collaboration is it's a collaboration of all of the large, defined as at least 1,000 randomized patients, long-term, defined as at least 2 years duration, randomized trials of statin therapy. It includes 23 trials of a statin versus no statin. Most of them are placebo-controlled, about 140,000 randomized patients, and 5 trials that looked at a high versus a low dose of a statin. And its aim is to conduct comprehensive analyses of all of the effects of statin therapy, both beneficial and adverse. There's been a range of these 9 very high-profile papers from the CTT collaboration over the last 20 years or so, and these have really revolutionized the way statins are used throughout the world. Now, don't worry, I'm not going to go through the results of all 9 papers. Kids, that's your homework this weekend. But I'm just going to give a brief summary of 3 key results. So the first is, what are the benefits of statins? So I'm going to show you what the effects of statins are on major vascular events. And this is evidence derived from 170,000 randomized randomized patients, treated for an average of 5 years. So with statistics, the bigger sample size you get, the more reliable your answers in terms of random errors. And if you do randomized trials, then you eliminate the chance of moderate biases. Okay, so again, I'm going to show you one of these forest plots. I'll take you through it reasonably quickly. So again, this line means that statins have absolutely no effect whatsoever on the condition we're talking about. Blobs to the left mean that statins are good. They reduce the risk of these things. And the uncertainty reflected by a line or the width of this diamond reflects how sure we are about our point estimate, so-called confidence interval. So what you can see is that for each 1 millimole per litre reduction in LDL cholesterol, statins reduce the risk of major coronary events, so heart attacks, coronary death, by about 1/4, reduce the risk of procedures to unblock your arteries by about 1/4, and overall reduce the risk of stroke by about 16% or so. And if you add up all of these things and you look at the probability of any one of these things happening, then statins reduce the risk of these what's called major vascular events by just over 1/5. So those are the benefits. They're substantial and they're undisputed. These are relative reductions in risk. What does this mean in terms of absolute reductions? So if you take someone typical, might have an average cholesterol of 3.5 millimoles per litre and a 5-year risk of a major vascular event of perhaps 20%. Give them a standard statin, it'll reduce their risk by 1/5. It'll bring it down to something more like 15-16%. If you give them more statin, a higher dose of a statin, it will reduce their risk further. So the combined evidence is about a 1/3, so a 34% relative risk reduction for a 1.5 millimole per litre reduction in LDL cholesterol, the bad cholesterol. But of course, some statins can actually do a lot more than that. If you've got a high cholesterol, high-dose statins can actually produce a much bigger reduction in cholesterol. They might produce maybe a 2 millimole per litre reduction in LDL cholesterol. And if you do that, you get about a 40% reduction in the risk of a major vascular event. So very substantial reductions. Okay, which is all well and good. Are there any risks? So I mentioned cancer in the context of ezetimibe. This is a meta-analysis of all of the cancer data that's ever been collected in placebo-controlled trials of statins. Actually, all of the trials of statins, high versus low doses, and statin versus placebo. So in these trials, again, this is now 175,000 people, 27 trials. 10,000 of them developed a new cancer during the trial, and the balance is 5,221 versus 5,211. If I gave you 10,431 coins and tossed them in the air, and they're fair coins, you would be stunned if you got that many heads and that many tails. It's bang on 1.00. So absolutely no effect on cancer, either in year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5, year 6, year 7. So extremely reassuring. And because I'd had my media training, Colin was happy for me to present this at a major conference. And so I went to the European Society of Cardiology and I presented these results, and this was reported in their kind of local newspaper sort of thing for the scientists. Meta-analysis of 26 major statin trials fails to find statistical link with cancer. Technically true. I don't really like it. That as a title kind of implies that I was disappointed. I was hoping to find a link with cancer, but it was technically accurate. And this time, I'm pleased to say I do have more quotes rather than just yes or no. Daily Express picked this up as well. Statins do not cause cancer, new research shows. Technically wrong as a title. There's no evidence that they do rather than they don't, but actually for a paper, that did what we wanted. Okay, and the last comment about statins. What about other symptoms? So if you're given a statin, you're likely, your doctor's going to want you to take it for life. And there are other conditions that you might think that might put you off taking them. And for various reasons, if you're given a statin or prescribed a statin, your doctor will ask you to report muscle pain if it happens, because very, very rarely statins can cause severe muscle pain. But of course, if you tell somebody that the pill they're about to be given might cause you muscle pain, then whenever you get muscle pain, you're more likely to attribute it to the drug you've been given, even if the drug you've been given is actually a placebo. And remember, these trials, patients don't know what they're on. They've got a 50-50 chance of either being on a statin or being on a totally useless placebo. And so what we can do in placebo-controlled trials is look at the muscle reporting rates in placebo-allocated versus statin-allocated patients. And here are the results. So this is 120,000 patients. 33,000 of them reported muscle pain, at least once during the trial, so just over a quarter. And this is what happens in year 1. Among patients allocated placebo, the rate is 155 per thousand per year. It is slightly higher with statin therapy, 165 per thousand per year, corresponding to a relative risk of 1.07. So a 7% increase in the probability of reporting muscle pain. So there is an increase, but it's very small. The excess is this shaded area here. After year 1, 50 versus 50, absolute no excess at all. So what does this mean? It means that even in the first year of taking a statin, more than 90% of the height of this bar, more than 90% of the time it's not due to the statin. It's due to something else, due to some other factor. Okay. I'd like to change tack a bit now and talk about the last end of my title, which is Mexico. And I'm probably going to have to speed up a little bit. So I'd like to start by acknowledging all the people I've worked with on the study over the years. Now, I've been going to Mexico on and off for about 15 years, which led some people to think maybe I've got some sort of double life. Maybe I've actually got another young family out there. And in some ways I do, but it's not quite what you're thinking. And this is really my family in Mexico. It's a man called Jesus Alegre, who I've had the privilege of working with for, nearly 20 years now. And as you can see by comparing this picture with this picture, we haven't changed a day over those 20 years. And there's some nice pictures of various other people I've been lucky enough to bring with me over the years, including Richard looking very suspiciously at this green cocktail that Jesus had brought in. So what is the Mexico City prospective study? So it's an observational cohort study. It's 150, actually nearly 160,000 randomized, 160,000 individuals living in Mexico City who were recruited into a study between 1998 and 2004. They were asked questions about their lifestyle. Do they drink? Do they smoke? What diseases have they had? They had some measurements taken, like blood pressure, height, weight, things like that. And they gave a blood sample from which various things have been measured in the past. I joined CTSU here, so luckily for me, right at the very end of when all of the hard work had been done. And for any kind of younger epidemiologists out there, I can highly recommend this as a strategy to join right at the end of when a good study has just started. There's a lot of information that was collected at baseline, socio-demographic characteristics, lifestyle characteristics. For the 100,000 women in the study, information on reproductive history, physical measurements, and this blood sample from which future assays have been done. A few years ago, we also did a resurvey of a subset of survivors, 10,000 survivors, where we asked similar questions, did similar measurements, took another blood sample, but also did a few enhancements for various reasons, to try and better understand how factors change over time. And I'm really proud of the papers we've published over the last 15 years or so. We focused deliberetely on what I still believe are the major risk factors for disease across populations. There's a reasonable number of, I think, very nice papers that have come out, and these have changed practice. Now, what's special about Mexico compared with other populations is the very high prevalence of obesity and diabetes. So at recruitment at the turn of the century, around a half of the women and a third of the men had a body mass index of at least 30 kilograms per meter squared, so what you'd think of as, or what you'd know as obese. And by age 60, about 1 in 5 of the men, 20%, and 1 in 5 of the women already had a previous diagnosis of diabetes. And this is much higher than you'd see in the UK or the US around about the same time. So I'm going to fairly rapidly run through 4 key results on diabetes, blood pressure, smoking, and adiposity before I close. So for diabetes, what did we know 10 years ago? Well, we know there's lots of people in the world with diabetes, over 400 million about 10 years ago, and we know it's going to increase. We know that in high-income countries where diabetes can be well diagnosed and well treated, then a diagnosis of diabetes is associated with about a doubling in the all-cause mortality rate. But we also know that in low and middle-income countries, Mexico is an upper middle-income country, resources to manage diabetes may be more limited and use of other drugs may be underutilized. So I've shown you this picture that shows you how common diabetes is in the population. But from the blood sample, we were also able to measure the amount of sugar in the blood. And the average, what's called glycosylated hemoglobin in the blood in people with diabetes was 9%, which is much higher than you would expect in a population of people with diabetes in the UK. And in people without diabetes, their blood sugar was normal, as you'd expect, 5.6%. So there's a much bigger difference in what's called glycemic control between those with and without diabetes. And what this resulted in was a much bigger relative risk of mortality associated with the diagnosis of diabetes. So if we consider deaths before age 60, diabetes didn't double the all-cause mortality rate, it increased it by a factor of 5. If you look at deaths at ages 60 to 74, it didn't double the all-cause mortality rate, it trebled it. So on average, for deaths that you might think of as premature before age 75, a diagnosis of diabetes was associated with a quadrupling in the all-cause mortality rate. Now, if you look at the death certificates of these individuals who died, you can break down where the excesses are. And you can see that by far the largest absolute excess risk of diabetes, the blue sections of these bars, was from death from kidney disease, where the relative risk was 20 for someone with versus without diabetes. And then numbers more like 4, 5 for vascular diseases, and death, as well as deaths from infection. And if you add up all of these blue sections and compare it to all of the deaths before age 75, then you conclude that about a third of all deaths in this population were due to diabetes. And unsurprisingly, when these results came out, they had a big impact in Mexico. One of the principal investigators in Mexico happened to be the Undersecretary for Health for Mexico at the time, and so we were in a fantastic position to turn these scientific results into policy immediately, literally on day 1 of publication. And following our publication, actually 2 days before, there's another story there, Mexico introduced a range of new policies directed towards the control of obesity and diabetes. We had some part to play there, which I'm very proud. So if we move quickly to adiposity, so what do I mean by adiposity? I'm largely talking about body mass index or other measures of the distribution of fat around the body. So there'd been an hypothesis that excess adiposity, high BMI, was not associated with increased risk of disease in Mexicans. But actually, when you got the analyses straight with large enough numbers, you can see that above 25, there's a very clear positive association. So people with higher BMI had higher risks of all-cause death, 30% increase in mortality risk for each 5 kilograms per meter squared units of BMI. Other ways of looking at adiposity are the ratio of the waist to the hip circumference, reflects where the fat is stored around the body, or simply just the waist circumference, and you get similar patterns of association. And then you can relate again these relative risk indices into what they might mean in terms of absolute risk. So if you apply these relative effects to survival estimates around about the same time across the whole of Mexico, and you can take a man or woman in Mexico with BMIs of 25, 30, 35 or 40, you can see the substantial differences in the probability of surviving the next 40 years. So survival from age 40 to 80 would be 68% likely in the leaner people, but only 43% likely in the morbidly obese. I showed you some slides on blood pressure from the Prospective Studies collaboration. You saw these beautifully straight associations between blood pressure and the risk of coronary heart disease. And actually, Mexicans are humans too, just like people in these other studies. And when again you get the numbers straight and you think about the various particular biases that can occur, we see something very similar in this Mexican population. So if every 20 millimeters lower systolic blood pressure, associated with about a halving in the risk of stroke, about a 1/3 reduction in the risk of coronary heart disease. And if you add up all vascular diseases, again, about a 1/3 reduction in the risk of any vascular death before age 35. Okay, and just very rapidly, because this diabetes is so common in Mexico and associated with such a high mortality, what a higher blood pressure means in absolute terms much more for someone with versus without diabetes. So here you've got 3 bars for each group of blood pressure, and you can see the absolute differences between the blood pressure groups is smaller for those without diabetes than it is without diabetes, because the people with diabetes are at higher initial risk. And finally, for smoking. So again, in Mexico, what's common regarding smoking is that there's lots of people do smoke, particularly men. About half of the men smoke, but they don't smoke very much. What we call low-intensity smoking is extremely common. So one of the first few years I went there, it was, you pull up at a traffic light, and the vendor would come up to your window and just try and sell you a cigarette, not a pack of cigarettes, but a single cigarette. And so lots of men, in particular, would smoke literally 1 a day. So it's common. I said half. It seems like this is wrong. So a third of male and 40% of female smokers reported smoking less than daily. That's right. Sorry, half of the men smoked, and overall a third smoked less than daily. Nonetheless, if you can look at the never smokers versus the daily smokers, less than 10 cigarettes per day, who smoked on average 4 cigarettes per day. The daily smokers of at least 10 cigarettes per day, who smoked on average 12 a day. You can say there's really striking, really clear, kind of obvious association between smoking and the increased risk of dying. And like in other populations, we're also able to study what happens when you quit. And like in other populations, quitting substantially reduced these risks. Now, one of the things we're moving into now in the Mexican cohort is genetics. And this work's been led by Jason Torres here. Jason can tell you what this means. I don't understand most of it. But this is a large-scale genetic data is now available through an international academic industry partnership, where we've genotyped the entire cohort and we've exome sequenced the entire cohort. So the exome is the part of the human genome responsible for proteins. And there's lots of things we can do. We can discover new genetic causes of disease. We can act as replication studies for what other people have found. We can do these things called fine mapping to try and zoom in on the causal variants. We can do these things called Mendelian randomization studies, a bit like randomized trials. And there are other things we can do, phenome-wide association studies, risk prediction tools. And in addition, we have whole genome sequencing in 10,000. Now, for my part, I played a big part in helping establish this as a resource, and then crucially employing someone who understood all of this, and Jason is now building his own team. And very recently, I'm really delighted to say we've reached an agreement with DNA Nexus and with Amazon Web Services to release these data for free to Mexican researchers on a research analysis platform. Okay, so at nearly 6 minutes to 6, that's where my lecture should have been ending, and I should have just been saying thank you now, and we could all have gone outside and had a drink and a nibble. But of course, my lecture wasn't 3 years ago, and we all know why. So at the end of 2019, this thing came along, the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And in some ways, COVID-19 was both the best and worst time to be an epidemiologist. On the upside, suddenly everyone in the world knew what epidemiology was, and it was the sexiest science in the world. On the downside, within about, I reckon, 10 to 11 days, everyone in the world thought they were an epidemiologist. And if they didn't know the answer themselves, they assumed that you must know an answer because you're a card-carrying epidemiologist. And the truth is, very few people did know anything at the start. This was a brand new virus. We knew nothing, and we were really starting from scratch. And as you'll all know, I think, various people in this department ditched their day jobs and worked on COVID-19 and made really substantial contributions to this gap in knowledge. The study I want to talk about is the recovery trial, which was initiated by Martin Landre here and Peter Horby from NDM. Peter's on a beach in Brazil at the moment. He says he's really sorry he couldn't make it. And it must have been middle of March when the COVID pandemic was now really hitting the north of Italy very badly. And it was kind of obvious that we'd be working from home at some point in the future. And Richard Haynes, he started my lecture, also the end of my lecture. Richard Haynes was walking past my office and he said, John, just so you know, Martin's setting up a trial. It's called Recovery. It's going to try and randomise all of the patients that we're going to be having in the UK over the next few weeks and months to see if we can find any treatments that work. And I said, okay. I said, I know where this is going. And he said, what we really need, we need a statistician. We need a statistician to be able to do analyses, rapidly, real time, reliably, someone who's really good, someone who's not going to make mistakes, and they're going to need to be able to also do their day jobs at the same time. I said, okay. I said, Richard, that's fine, just ask. And so he did. And he said, do you think Natalie would do it? And I don't know where Natalie is, actually, but just put your hand up. There you are, Natalie. So I smiled, and I said, well, I'm sure she would, yeah. I mean, you're right, she's brilliant. And I said, but how about Richard, why don't we both do it? Because that way, actually, I recognise it's important. I'd like to contribute myself. And actually, there's lots of advantages of having two people analysing these data at the same time. You'll reduce your probability of any screw-ups quite considerably. And also, one of us might get ill. One of us might get COVID over the next few weeks or months and be out of action, and that really wasn't going to be good. And so we did. Natalie and I, at the first few months of the pandemic, had a lot of conference calls saying, I'm looking at this result. Did you get that? So, yeah, I got that. Okay, thank goodness. And there was a lot to do in the first year, and this is what we did. This is just the first year of the pandemic. The first patient was randomised on the 19th of March 2020, 4 days before the first national lockdown in the UK. And during that first year, Martin and Richard and Peter and others tested 10 treatments, all versus no treatment or versus usual care. So dexamethasone, lopinavir, convalescent plasma, tocilizumab, various drugs, new drugs, but also old ones that were in the cupboard, like aspirin, colchicine, dexamethasone. And this graph shows the number of patients that were randomised on each day from the end of March 2020 to just the start of April 2021. And you can see in that first wave of the epidemic, they were randomising nearly 500 patients a day. In fact, the second wave was even worse. They were randomising over 500 patients a day. This is dreadful, and we all remember it, very well. Actually very good for a randomised trial because the data was absolutely flooding in on a daily basis. We were able to really get much more certainty about what was going on. And of course, the 16th of June 2020 at 10 Downing Street, about 6 p.m. Sir Patrick Vallance, the Chief Scientific Advisor, now Sir Peter Horby, the co-PI of the trial, and Boris stood together at one of the press conferences where Peter took the world through these dexamethasone results, where we showed that in the sickest patients, those who needed invasive mechanical ventilation when they're in hospital, this simple drug that was available on every shelf in every hospital in the world reduced mortality by 1/3. And also in patients who weren't quite that sick but still couldn't breathe without some help, reduced mortality by 1/5. And I like to think this picture is Peter describing the results, Patrick understanding them, and Boris having no clue what was going on at all. Peter does tell me that after the end of this there was no party at 10 Downing Street, at least not one that he was invited to. Okay, so that we're nearly there, a couple of minutes to go. Sorry, I had to speed up a little bit. So here are the dexamethasone results, but I said Recovery tested 10 drugs in that first year, and it found that some things unfortunately didn't work, fine, but it's equally important to know reliably that something doesn't work as it is to know that something does. But in addition to dexamethasone, there have been also additional reductions in risk by giving other types of drugs, tocilizumab, baricitinib in seronegative patients, a drug called casirivimab, indevimab. So that really should now be the end, and that is basically the end. So again, I want to thank all of you, all of my colleagues, as well as my family and friends who came here today. I've only been able to mention a few of you by name and show a few of you in pictures, but I really have had the privilege of working with so many people. I do want to mention that with a different hat, with outside of my scientific role, I had the privilege of being Deputy Director of Graduate Studies for several years, where I was really, I'm delighted to work with Sasha Shepherd, can't see if she's here or not, Maria and Zoe and Mary Alice. And thank you all for making that a fantastic experience. It was great to know all of the students that we were inviting in and supervisors too. Thanks to Derek, who's always in that back corner, for being a great office mate for the first 15 years or so. I'm sure he's still a good office mate, but we've now split up. For Bob, where are you, Bob? For persuading me about 10 years ago that it would be absolutely fine to combine CTSU with a part-time golf membership about half a mile that way. I'm sure there's other people I couldn't thank. But most of all, I would like to thank my family, only some of whom have been able to come here today. We've always been extremely supportive of whatever I've wanted to do in my life, including Mum, when I said I wanted to move to the other side of the world, without ever pushing me into any particular direction, allowing me to make my own decisions. When I talk about my family, I don't just mean my mum and dad, but also my family I married into, Billy and Nancy are here today, who welcomed me into their lives, with open arms from the very start. Which, given that I'm a Welsh Everton fan rather than an English Liverpool fan, I think really does speak a lot about you, Billy. But my biggest thanks, of course, to Ellen for supporting me and being there with me every step of the way, helping me to achieve what I have in my career, often compromising your own career in the process. And also kids, Laura and Thomas, thanks for helping to keep me grounded in reality every day when I come home. So that is the end. Sorry I've gone 2 minutes over. Thank you very much. And I think there are some drinks and nibbles outside.
Thanks very much, John. Thanks very much for everyone coming. As John says, there are refreshments outside and hope you'll join us. You can ask Jonathan for some of the more embarrassing things that have happened during the last 20 years or so. A little gift from the department to remember today, but also a gift from friends involved in the Mexico study. And you probably want to open that up for others to see.
Perfect. Oh, I've just seen the back. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, everyone. Please come and join us.